Let me tell you about a quiet widow who bought the roof of a dead warehouse on Poland Avenue on the east side of Youngstown, Ohio, and what I watched her do up there from the second-floor window of my little print shop across the alley for 6 long years. My name is not the part of this story that matters. What matters is that my print shop sat directly across a narrow brick alley from the Brier Hill warehouse, close enough that from my back window I could see the whole flat black roof of that abandoned building, and far enough away that for a long stretch of time I could not make sense of one single thing she was doing up there. The first morning she went up that fire escape, I was standing at my composing bench with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, watching the sun come up gray and heavy over the old blast furnace ruins of Brier Hill. It was the second Monday of April, 2011, a cold morning. The kind of raw, wet spring the Mahoning Valley gives you 3 years after everyone stopped pretending the mills were coming back. She was up there in a faded blue work coat, with what looked from 40 yards off like a length of white plastic pipe and a spool of twine, walking a slow line across the tar roof, laying down some kind of grid I could not read. That building had a name, and the name was not a kind one. Folks around Brier Hill called it the roasting pan. It was just dead. 2,400 square feet of black tar and torn seams on top of a 3-story brick warehouse that had sat empty since the summer of 1998. When the sun hit that roof in July, you could see the heat waves shimmer off it from 4 blocks away. 2 roofing contractors had walked away from the place, saying the deck underneath was too soft to trust. The last man to own it was a scrap dealer named Vinnie Marchetti, who bought it thinking he'd store salvage steel inside. He gave it up when the bank came for his yard. She had picked it up at a county auction that March for $4,200, cash on the barrel. Nobody bid against her. The clerk at the auction later told my neighbor she was the only person in the room who raised her paddle. Her name was Ingrid Halversen, 58 years old that spring. Norwegian American, born up in Ashtabula County, moved down to Youngstown as a young bride in 1974. Lean, quiet, gray blonde hair pinned back under a wool cap. She had a way of moving that told you nothing about what she was thinking. Her husband, Ingrid Halversen, had worked 31 years as a shift foreman at Republic Steel over on Poland Avenue, 3 blocks from that warehouse. He died of lung cancer in November of 2010. She buried him at Belmont Park Cemetery on a Tuesday. By April, she was up on that roof with a plastic pipe and a spool of twine. Now here's what you need to understand. Nobody in Brier Hill kept bees. Not in 2011. Not in the shadow of a rusted-out steel mill on the east side of Youngstown. The nearest working apiary was 14 miles south, out past Canfield, run by a family called the Kuktas, who had 80 hives on 120 acres of clover. That was where bees belonged. Green fields, running creek, no smoke. Not on top of an abandoned warehouse next to a slag heap. The first hive box went up that fire escape on the last Saturday in April. She carried it up herself, wooden, unpainted, empty. I counted the trips. 14 hive boxes in all, over 3 Saturdays. She hauled every one of them up 3 flights of iron stairs on her own back. Nobody helped her. Nobody offered. By the middle of May, there were 14 white wooden hives standing in a careful pattern on that black roof. All their entrances facing the same direction, northeast, into the low morning sun coming up over the Mahoning River. She spaced them out further apart than any beekeeper I'd ever seen do it. Almost 6 feet between hives. She had built little wooden platforms under each one to keep them a few inches off that hot tar. I watched her do all of it from my window while I ran the press downstairs on rush jobs for the union hall. The first laughter I heard came from the barbershop on the ground floor of my building. A retired mill hand named Frank Ostrowski said, and I remember it word for word because he said it 3 times that week. That woman is gonna cook her bugs on that black roof by the 4th of July. The men in that barbershop had known Ingrid Halversen for 30 years. They had drunk beer with him at the Lithuanian Club. They shook their heads about his widow, Vinnie Marchetti, the same scrap dealer who used to own the building. Drove past one afternoon in his flatbed truck, saw her up there, and hollered up something ugly. I could not make out the words, but I could read the tone. He called her the honey lady from the widow's home, and that name stuck around Brier Hill for a long while. The local paper, The Vindicator, ran a small piece about her in the June 18th edition, 2011, bottom of page 7. The headline called her the beekeeping ghost of Steeltown. The reporter had never gone up on the roof. He wrote 3 paragraphs about how a strange widow was putting boxes up on a dead building and how the neighbors were nervous about swarms. She read that piece. I know because I saw her reading it at the counter of the diner on Wilson Avenue. She folded the paper up, set it neatly beside her coffee cup, paid, and left. She never said one word back to anyone. Not once in 6 years did I hear that woman defend herself. And that's the part that stayed with me. Because at the time, watching her from my window that first summer, I thought the same thing everyone else did. I thought she was a grieving woman doing a strange, sad thing to fill up the hours after her husband was gone. I thought the bees would die in the heat, or drown in a storm, or starve in a neighborhood where nothing grew but ragweed and pigeon grass in the cracks of a broken sidewalk. I was wrong about all of it, but I would not know I was wrong for another 3 summers. Educational note: urban beekeeping in old industrial cities has a longer history than most people realize. In the 1920s and 30s, cities like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Youngstown had active rooftop apiaries maintained by immigrant Scandinavian and German beekeepers who understood that flowering street trees, abandoned garden lots, and vacant land could produce a longer, more varied nectar season than open farmland. The practice largely died out after the Second World War, as those neighborhoods emptied and beekeeping shifted to commercial rural operations. Only recently have small keepers begun rediscovering what those older hands already knew. But that's not what this story is really about. Part 2. The thing you have to understand about Ingrid Halversen is that she was not making this up as she went along. And that took me the better part of 2 years to figure out. The first hint I got came in the middle of June 2011, about 5 weeks after she set up the hives. I was walking to the diner on Wilson Avenue for lunch, and I passed her sitting on the bench outside her little rented flat on Cherry Street with a cardboard box open on her lap. Inside that box was a stack of small leather-bound notebooks, tied together with faded brown twine. She was reading one of them slowly, following a line with her finger, and she was writing notes on a yellow legal pad beside her. I said hello. She nodded without looking up. I glanced down at the open notebook page as I passed. The handwriting was in a spidery old hand, and half the words on that page were not English. They were Norwegian. Later that summer, I did the neighborly thing and asked her, at the counter of the diner where she took her lunch every Wednesday, what those little books were. She was slow to answer, but she did. She told me they belonged to her husband's grandfather, a man named Magnus Halversen. Magnus had come to America from a place called Hardanger in Norway in 1923. He had been a beekeeper at the Ohio State Agricultural Experiment Station in Worcester from 1925 until 1942. When he retired, he had kept careful notes his whole working life, in Norwegian, about a method he called the byens nektarkalender. In English, that means the city nectar calendar. Now, here is what those notebooks contained, and what nobody in Brier Hill, Ohio knew that spring. Magnus Halversen had spent 14 years documenting exactly which trees, weeds, and vacant lot flowers in industrial American cities produced nectar, in what weeks, and in what quantities. Linden trees along the old streetcar lines, black locust left over from 19th century estates, catalpa around old company houses, wild clover in vacant lots, goldenrod on the slag piles. He had discovered that a properly placed hive in an old industrial neighborhood could work a longer, more varied nectar flow than a rural hive in open clover. From late April into early October, with almost no gaps. Country bees eat 3 things at most. City bees eat 40. And the honey carries every one of those flavors folded into it. Magnus had also worked out the placement rules. He wrote them down in the notebook from 1928. The entrances of the hives must face northeast to catch the earliest morning sun and to shelter the bees from the prevailing southwest winds. The hives must sit above the level of the ground haze in industrial neighborhoods, which meant rooftops, at least 2 full stories up. And the hives must sit on light-colored platforms above dark roofing material, with a gap of 4 inches of open air underneath, to keep the brood chamber from cooking in July. Ingrid had spent 30 years watching her husband Eric keep 3 small hives in the backyard of their house on Cherry Street. He kept them because his grandfather Magnus had kept them. It was a family thing. Eric had never done anything with the notebooks. They sat in a cedar chest in the attic for 4 decades. After Eric died, Ingrid went up into that attic on a cold January morning and opened the chest for the first time in her married life. She spent that whole winter reading those notebooks. She taught herself enough Norwegian to follow them, using an old Norwegian English dictionary her mother-in-law had left behind. By the time the ground thawed in March, she knew exactly what she was going to do, and she knew exactly where. Brier Hill was, in Magnus Halversen's system, an almost perfect city apiary. Old linden trees on Steel Street, planted before the mill was built. Black locust grove along the Mahoning riverbank. Catalpa trees around every old company duplex on Andrews Avenue. Vacant garden lots filled with clover, chicory, wild mint, and Queen Anne's lace. The blast furnace ruins were fringed with sumac and goldenrod, and nobody in that neighborhood had kept bees in 70 years. The nectar flow was untouched. She bought the warehouse roof because it was 3 stories up, flat, and pointed exactly northeast. That was the entire reason. It had nothing to do with grief. It had everything to do with page 14 of a notebook written in 1928. But nobody in Brier Hill knew any of that, so the laughter continued. Frank Ostrowski, the retired mill hand at the barbershop, kept a running joke through the summer of 2012. He would come out on the sidewalk at noon and squint up at the warehouse roof and holler, "How them roasted bees today, Ingrid?" She would nod politely if she was down on the sidewalk. She would not answer if she was up on the roof. She never once got angry. The Kuchta family, the beekeepers out past Canfield, came into town for a bee supply order at the feed store in June of 2012. The old man, Stan Kuchta, was told about the widow with the 14 hives on the abandoned warehouse. He laughed hard and said, in front of 6 people at the counter, "In 3 years she won't have 3 hives left. You cannot keep bees in Brier Hill." That story got repeated up and down the east side. The Vindicator ran another short piece on her that fall. This one had a photograph. She was on the roof, in her blue work coat, standing beside one of the hives, not smiling. The caption called her Youngstown's most stubborn widow. She cut that clipping out with a pair of scissors and stuck it inside the front cover of one of Magnus Halversen's notebooks. I saw it there years later, and this is the part that matters. She never told any of them what she was doing. She never showed the notebooks. She never explained the northeast entrance rule. She never mentioned Magnus Halversen at all. She just kept working. Every morning at first light, up the fire escape. Every evening at dusk, back down. 6 days a week. In snow. In rain, in the deep July heat that Frank Ostrowski said was going to kill her bees. By the fall of 2013, at the end of her 3rd season, she had lost only 1 hive to swarming, and none at all to heat or cold. She was pulling roughly 140 pounds of honey per year from 13 hives. She was selling it in half-pound jars for $8 each at a little stand in front of the diner on Saturday mornings. She was making at that point about $2,000 a year in honey money. That was not the point either. The point was still coming. Educational note. Nectar produced by bees foraging in mixed urban environments carries a distinct chemical signature. It contains a broader spectrum of floral compounds than honey from monoculture crops, which is why properly harvested urban honey often shows complex flavor notes that specialty markets prize. The concentration of pollen types in a single tablespoon of good city honey can be as high as 40 distinct species, compared to 4 or 5 for standard clover honey. This is not a modern discovery. Beekeepers in 19th century Vienna, Prague, and Oslo documented these effects 150 years ago, and that's when everything changed. Part 3. The storm came in on the afternoon of Wednesday, July 16th, 2014. I remember the date because I had a rush print job for a union rally, and the power flickered so hard around 3 o'clock that I lost 200 sheets on the press. The sky went from a hot yellow-white to a low bruised green in about 11 minutes. I stood at the window watching a bank of black cloud roll in from the west over the Mahoning River. It was the kind of storm the old-timers around here call a mill breaker. The hail started at 3:22. I was standing at the back window watching the warehouse roof across the alley. The first stones I saw hit the tin awning of the barbershop below me and bounced 10 feet into the air. They were the size of pecans. Then, inside 2 minutes, they were the size of walnuts. Ice balls the size of grown men's knuckles coming down at 40 miles an hour, hammering on the tar roof across the alley for close to 40 full minutes without a break. I could see the hives up there through the sheets of hail, 14 white wooden boxes standing in the dark. I remember thinking, that's it. She's lost every one of them. Nothing wooden survives a hailstorm like this. Roof shingles were coming off houses all over the east side. Car windshields were shattering on Poland Avenue. A whole plate glass storefront on Wilson blew inward when a hailstone the size of a baseball hit it dead center. The storm ended a little after 4. I stood at my window and watched Ingrid Halversen come out of her flat on Cherry Street in her blue work coat, walk the 2 blocks over to the warehouse in the drizzle that came after, and go up that fire escape. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked up those iron stairs one at a time, the way she had walked them for 3.5 years. I could not see clearly what was up there because there was still a thin curtain of rain, but I could see her walking the rows. She stopped at each hive. She stood beside it. She put her hand on the top of it. Then she moved to the next one. She was up there for 2 hours. When she came down, her face had not changed one line from what it looked like when she went up. I thought she was hiding a broken heart. The next morning, at first light, I climbed up onto the roof of my own building with a pair of binoculars my brother-in-law had given me for watching Cleveland Browns games. And I looked across the alley at that black warehouse roof. 12 of the 14 hives were standing. 2 had been knocked partway off their platforms, one on the northwest corner and one on the southeast. Both of those 2, she had already lifted back into place. All 12 of the standing hives had a strange thing in front of them that I had not been able to see clearly for 3 years from my window. Each hive had a triangular metal shield in front of it, about 4 feet tall, tilted back at what I could only guess was a 45-degree angle. The shields were made of old rusted sheet steel, the kind they used to roll off the plate mill at Republic Steel. Later I found out, Ingrid Halversen had brought scrap sheet steel home from the mill for 31 years. Whenever a bad plate came off the line, and stacked it against the shed in his backyard. There must have been 100 sheets back there when he died. Ingrid had hauled them, one by one, up that fire escape over the winter of 2013. She had cut them to size with a set of tin snips. She had bent them at the angle Magnus Halversen described on page 31 of the notebook from 1928. Magnus had drawn the shield design himself, in pencil, with the angle marked in degrees and the height marked in inches. The shields deflected hail. They deflected westerly wind. They deflected direct afternoon sun in July. Magnus Halversen had figured this out on his own, working with Rooftop hives in Cleveland in the 1920s, when he was still riding the streetcar in from Worcester to work weekends for the City Agricultural Society. Ingrid had lost, in the worst hailstorm the Mahoning Valley had seen in 23 years. 2 hives out of 14. Both were repairable. She lost not one queen. She lost about 6 pounds of honey stores. Everyone else on the east side who kept anything at all outdoors, chickens, tomatoes, patio furniture, was ruined that afternoon. The Vindicator did not write about it. Nobody at the barbershop said anything. Frank Ostrowski was quiet for 2 weeks. That is how Brier Hill acknowledged that it had been wrong. It stopped talking. 6 weeks later, at the end of August 2014, the county extension office ran a small farm and food fair in the parking lot of the old Edora Park on the south side of town. Ingrid took a folding card table and 40 half-pound jars of honey. It was the first time she had brought her honey to a public event outside our neighborhood. A young woman walked down the row of card tables that Saturday morning, maybe 32, dark hair pinned up, sharp eyes. She was a pastry chef named Elise Marchetta from a fine dining restaurant in Cleveland. She had driven the 70 miles down that morning because her sous chef, whose family lived in Brier Hill, had told her about the widow with the rooftop bees. She stopped at the table. She asked Ingrid for a taste. Ingrid handed her a small wooden dipper with a bead of honey on the tip. Elise Marchetta closed her eyes. She held the honey on her tongue for a long time. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Ingrid Halversen and said, "What is in this?" Ingrid said, "Linden, locust, catalpa, clover, wild mint, sumac, and a little smoke." Elise said, "Smoke." Ingrid said, "That comes from where the bees fly. There is nothing I can do about it. It is Brier Hill." Elise Marchetta stood at that card table for 11 minutes. She bought all 40 jars. She wrote Ingrid a check for $320. She asked when the next harvest would be. She left her phone number on a napkin. That was the first time in 5 years that anyone from outside the Mahoning Valley had paid Ingrid Halversen full price for a jar of honey without laughing first. I did not know any of this that Saturday. I found it out 3 months later when I saw a truck with Cuyahoga County plates pull up in front of Ingrid's flat on Cherry Street and a young woman get out with a canvas bag full of empty jars. Educational note. Pastry chefs and confectioners in high-end kitchens rely on distinctive single-origin honeys, the same way winemakers rely on specific vineyards. The floral profile of a honey affects its behavior in caramel, its interaction with butter, and its capacity to balance salt in savory desserts. Well-known chefs in New York and Chicago have paid 3 and 4 times retail price for honeys from specific rooftops, farms, and forest lots that produce distinctive nectar signatures. A single unusual honey can define an entire seasonal menu. And this is the part that matters. Part 4. Word travels faster in the fine dining world than it does in a barbershop. By the spring of 2015, Elise Marchetta had told 2 other pastry chefs about the widow with the rooftop bees in Brier Hill. One was Hannah Voss, who ran the dessert kitchen at a restaurant in Chicago's West Loop. The other was Ben Delgado, head pastry chef at a hotel restaurant in downtown Pittsburgh. Ben told a friend in Indianapolis, a chef named Ray Kittinger. Ray told a chef in Detroit named Karen Vudas. By the summer of 2016, 5 pastry chefs from 5 different cities were making the drive to Youngstown, Ohio, twice a year, to buy the honey from Ingrid Halversen's 14 rooftop hives. And a 6th chef, a woman named Priya Nadkarni, who ran a bakery in Louisville, Kentucky, drove 8 hours straight up through the middle of the state to be at Ingrid's door on Harvest Day. They started calling the honey Steel Town Gold. Ingrid did not name it. Elise Marchetta named it, and it stuck. The honey sold, wholesale from Ingrid to the chefs, for $42 a pound. The chefs charged their guests $70 for a 2-ounce ramekin of it beside a dessert course. It was not for sale in stores. It was not for sale online. You could not buy it if you did not know Ingrid Halversen by name. 14 hives on a 2,400 square foot black tar roof produced in 2016, 618 pounds of finished honey. Ingrid Halversen made, that year, $25,956. Cash. From bees. On top of an abandoned warehouse. In Brier Hill. She still drove her husband's 1994 Ford F-150. She still lived in the rented flat on Cherry Street. The only thing she bought for herself that year was a new pair of Red Wing boots and a good wool coat for winter mornings on the roof. The barbershop on the ground floor of my building went quiet on the subject of the honey lady in the summer of 2015. It went politely respectful in the fall of 2016. By the summer of 2017, Frank Ostrowski was calling her Mrs. Halversen, both to her face and behind her back, and holding the barbershop door open for her when she walked past. Stan Kukta, the beekeeper from out past Canfield, who had said 3 years earlier that no bees could survive in Brier Hill, drove into town on a Tuesday morning in April of 2017. He knocked on Ingrid Halversen's door and asked her, in the polite formal way older men in this part of Ohio ask each other for help, if she would consider showing him her hive placement. His own operation was struggling. He had heard she knew something he did not. Ingrid led him into her flat, poured him coffee, opened the cardboard box with Magnus Halversen's notebooks, turned to page 14 of the one from 1928, and read it aloud to him in translation. He sat at that table for 4 hours, taking notes on the back of an envelope. When he left, he shook her hand at the door and said, "I owe you an apology, ma'am. I want to take back what I said at the feed store in 2012. Ingrid said, "It is all right, Mr. Kuchta. I did not mind then, and I do not mind now." He went home. He rebuilt his 80-hive operation using Magnus Halversen's rules. His yields went up 19%. That summer of 2017 was the last summer I watched Ingrid Halversen work from my window. In August, she came down off the roof one evening with a slower step than usual. She was 64 years old. She had been climbing 3 flights of iron stairs, 6 days a week, for 6.5 years. Her knees were done. She sat down on the bottom step and did not stand up for a while. The next spring, she trained a young man from the neighborhood to do the roof work. His name was Danny Ostrowski, Frank Ostrowski's grandson, 22 years old, home from 2 years in the Marines and not knowing what to do with himself. Ingrid taught him from the notebooks. Every rule Magnus had written down. She let him keep half the honey money for himself. The morning I came to see her for the last time before I sold my print shop and moved down to Florida to be near my daughter, it was the 2nd Wednesday of October, 2017. She had me in for coffee at her kitchen table. She poured it into thick white diner cups. She set a small tin can in front of me on the table with no lid on it. The can was old. The paint on the outside was worn down almost to bare metal, but you could still just barely read the handwriting on the top edge. It said, in careful ink, Ingrid Halversen, 1931. Inside the can was a spoonful of crystallized honey, dark amber, nearly black at the edges. Beside the can was a small wooden dipper, worn smooth from years of use. She told me the can had been Magnus Halversen's own. It was the tin he had kept his first Ohio honey in, the year he started at the Worcester station. She had found it in the cedar chest in the attic the same winter she found the notebooks. She kept it on her kitchen windowsill now with a spoonful of every year's harvest inside it, and she opened it for every chef and every neighbor who came to her door for the first time. I took the wooden dipper. I lifted a small bead of that dark honey. I put it on my tongue. I closed my eyes. And I understood at last what I had been watching for 6.5 years across an alley in Brier Hill. Ingrid Halversen sat across from me at her kitchen table, and she said, in her quiet, flat Ohio voice, "Everything dead has something living underneath it. You just have to be patient enough to find out what." I left Youngstown 2 weeks later. I sold the print shop and moved down to Sarasota. I still get a Christmas card from her every December. Last year's card had a photograph of Danny Ostrowski on the roof, in a blue work coat almost the same shade as hers, standing beside the 14 white hives with a smoke can in one hand. The card said on the back, in her careful handwriting, "The bees are still here, so is the honey, so are we." That tin can, with the spoonful of Magnus Halversen's 1931 honey, still sits on her kitchen windowsill. She has never emptied it. Educational note: the nectar composition of any honey is a permanent record of a landscape. In the same way a tree ring is a record of a summer. A single ounce of honey can be tested in a laboratory and matched with high precision to the neighborhood, the tree species, and the season in which it was gathered. This is why authenticity matters so much to serious chefs. A jar of true single-origin urban honey is not just a sweetener. It is a small physical archive of a specific place at a specific point in time. That is what those pastry chefs were driving 8 hours to buy. And that is what Magnus Halversen understood in 1928.